Welcome to the session for supporting reading development among early elementary English learners. My name is Alyssa Aerosmith, and I am an elementary literacy and dual language specialist for Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools in Charlotte, North Carolina. I may look familiar to you if you had the opportunity to attend the Council of the Great City Schools panel on Resilient Schools Strategies, Successes, and Challenges this morning. I am thrilled to introduce our presenter today and moderate a Q&A session after her presentation. Please add your questions to the chat box, and I will share them with our presenter after she completes her presentation. Please note, there are no materials for this presentation on the website. Our presenter today is Jeannette Mancilla-Martinez. Professor Mancilla-Martinez is an associate professor in the Department of Special Education at Peabody College. She has been researching the impact of language comprehension on reading comprehension and how to best support reading development for early elementary English learners. She is currently working on an IES grant for EMT in Espanol called Comprehensive Early Intervention to support school readiness skills for Spanish-speaking toddlers with language delays. The major goals of this project are to address the critical need for evidence-based interventions for Spanish-speaking families by testing the effectiveness of an adopted model of caregiver-implemented enhanced milieu teaching, abbreviated EMT, in a randomized controlled trial design. The target population of children for this study is multiply at risk for persistent language delays and later language-related academic difficulties. That is, the target population for this project is young children who already evidence significant delays in both language understanding and production. In addition, coming from low-income homes. This is a population for whom there are no current evidence-based interventions and for whom early, effective language intervention is essential to their later academic learning. Please note this presentation has been pre-recorded, but Professor Mancilla-Martinez and I will join you live at the conclusion of the presentation for the Q&A portion of this session. Now, please join me in welcoming Professor Jeannette Mancilla-Martinez.
My name is Jeannette Mancilla-Martinez, and I'm excited to spend some time with you today and discuss the reading development of early elementary English learners and how we can best support that development. I have a few items on the agenda for today, beginning with a brief snapshot of reading achievement and the demographic landscape in the United States, followed by just a handful of enduring debates centered around the issue of supporting young English learners' reading development, certainly not an exhaustive list, and then a few slides on opportunities that are available to us to better support their achievement. And we'll end with a discussion and a live Q&A. So starting with the reading achievement and demographic landscape, I wanted to start with an example of a reading comprehension assessment that fourth graders would get on the NAEP. And this is just a sampling of the passage, part of the passage that fourth graders would see. And on the right side, you see the comprehension question. What did the boy do to become successful? So this type of item is labeled as a locate and recall and is considered to be at approximately a medium difficulty level. In order to answer this question, and the task at hand in terms of making meaning from text is very complex and a lot of interrelated factors are involved. We can talk about reading fluency, we can talk about reading affect, having requisite background knowledge, for example, general domain cognition like executive function skills, but at a minimum, students must actually read the printed words that they're presented with and have some understanding of what those words mean. In this case, students would go to a specific section of the text because it is a locate and recall type question to be able to answer the question. And it is not verbatim what I have highlighted in red, where it begins with years past, but it's a sort of, I guess, like a summary or abbreviated version in somewhat different terms that students are supposed to be able to translate to effectively or successfully answer this comprehension question. So when we think about the many interrelated skills that are involved to make meaning from text, and at the risk of oversimplification, there might be varied opinions, but there is a lot of theoretical and empirical support for the very important roles of both language comprehension and word recognition for skilled reading. And many of you are probably, hopefully, pretty familiar with this kind of theoretical model of reading, certainly similar to the simple view of reading. And the reason that I tend to show this quite a lot, and the main reason that I love it quite a bit in terms of understanding what it takes to comprehend text, is the interwoven nature of these two really important strands, and the developmental aspect. So in a nutshell, word recognition skills should be increasingly automatic over time. And in the primary grade years, and we'll just say roughly K-2, there's a good amount of emphasis placed on hopefully ensuring that students develop adequate and age-appropriate word recognition skills. But at some point, we expect those skills to be quite automatic, and there's not a lot of instructional focus. Certainly, some students will continue to require instruction in word recognition. So by no means am I saying that that ends in the early elementary grades, but on average, that tends to be the instructional focus. Very different story with language comprehension. And as you can see from this visual, language comprehension can be proxied in many ways. We typically use vocabulary for a whole slew of reasons that I will get into a bit later. But language comprehension is something that students are developing throughout their lifespan. And in fact, the role of language comprehension becomes increasingly strategic over time. So that means that pretty much unlike word recognition, we don't stop teaching language and language development acquisition at some point in time in students' educational trajectories. Quite the contrary, students will continue to encounter more and more complex language, often referred to as academic language. And that language is increasingly predictive of reading comprehension outcomes once we start assessing reading comprehension more quote unquote purely. That typically begins after the primary grade years. But the influence of language comprehension and the development, more importantly, of language comprehension begins at birth, if not before. So really the question is, all right, as a field, we actually do know quite a lot about the many interrelated skills that are involved for successful reading comprehension. And again, at the risk of oversimplifying, we also know that it is really non-negotiable for reading comprehension that students have word reading skills and that they understand the meanings of those words. So again, these two components, word recognition, language comprehension. And these two factors are predictive for all students, meaning also the population of English learners that I will get into specifically momentarily. So this model is applicable, again, to all learners. So the question is, all right, if we have this information at hand already, and we know that these are important components for instruction to support students' reading comprehension development, how are students in the US faring in terms of reading comprehension? And unfortunately, it is not a rosy picture. We do have persistently low reading achievement in the US. And here I'm referring specifically to reading comprehension. This is based on the NAEP data. Generally speaking, about 1 in 3 US students can read at or above the proficient level. And this doesn't change very much whether I'm referring to, for example, 4th grade data on average or 8th grade. In fact, it is estimated that about 1 in 3 4th graders can read at or above proficient, and a pretty similar picture for 8th graders. So we have to really think about, and I won't get into too much of the potentially far-reaching negative life consequences of compromised reading comprehension achievement, but there is reason to worry and to at least be concerned, to say the least, and say, well, how can we better prepare students to succeed with the task of reading comprehension? Because reading comprehension is important in everything related to academic and educational achievement. So what are schools actually doing? And again, I hate to sound so somber, but when we think about the testing, kind of typical testing scenario in schools, in my view, we have a situation that really seems to point to a waiting to fail model. And what I mean by that is the typical scenario in school settings is such that there is a pretty big emphasis on the assessment of word level skills, especially during the primary grades, but even beyond, and very little assessment of language comprehension. In fact, I haven't gone to English learners, which you may be wondering, well, isn't this presentation about English learners? But I will in just a moment. The only time we really tap much in terms of language skills is when we are assessing students who come from a home where English is not the only language used. So what ends up happening is we often can be in a situation where there's an early identification dilemma. And the idea there is that if only word reading skills or largely word reading skills are being assessed and students seem to be doing okay, but we're not assessing language comprehension, it's almost as if suddenly we have students who start struggling with reading comprehension when we are able to assess reading comprehension after the primary grade years. And there is a pretty solid research base showing that early language comprehension skills are in fact predictive of later reading comprehension outcomes. And so I absolutely understand. I was a school teacher, an elementary school teacher myself before I got into the research and academia side of things. And it is really difficult to assess language comprehension compared with word reading skills. Not the least of which, one of the factors is the time it takes, and usually the one-on-one setting that is required to tap language comprehension skills. But it is something that I think as a nation, we really need to rethink if we're serious about better supporting students' reading comprehension outcomes. We can't ignore it or put it off to the side. And by it, I mean the assessment of language comprehension, given its crucial role. We know, if we think back to the example that I started with in terms of a typical reading comprehension type question that students in fourth grade might encounter, reading is a language-based process, and we need to assess language skills in order to support students. So, all right, now we finally get to English learners. And so I went back and forth quite a bit on this slide and how I wanted to, what term I wanted to use for this population of learners. And I decided, because this is the title of the actual presentation, that I would go ahead and stick with the term English learners. But I do want to acknowledge that there are many, some might say too many, terms that are often interchangeably used, and that should not be the case to refer to this population of learners. But if we just take one step back and think about students who come from homes in which a language that is not exclusively English is used, that would be the population of learners that in schools are often referred to as non-English language background, NELB. That literally means anyone who is not from a monolingual English-speaking home, independent of the language ability or abilities of the student. So for example, you might be from a Spanish-speaking home. You might have more or exclusive proficiency in English, let's say, but the scenario is such that developmentally you have been exposed to a language other than English at home. That is a different developmental experience than a monolingual English speaker who has been exposed to exclusively English all of their lives. All right, hopefully that hasn't confused folks too much, but the term English learner is really used very narrowly in terms of students whose English proficiency is actually impeding or affecting their ability to access the curriculum in English for school success. So I'm going to use the term English learners throughout, really understanding that there are many terms used to refer to this population of learners. But in this case, I am going to focus narrowly on those who are still developing their English proficiency. And so one of the important pieces to really keep in mind is that when we think about English learners, it's often thought about as kind of binary. Either you're monolingual or you're bilingual, aka like an English learner. And that is not the case. Language development and multi-language development is really on a gradient, and it's very contextual. So it's not an all or nothing phenomenon. And I can't underscore that enough, because we really need to understand this. And I hope I make that case more clearly as the presentation goes on. So what we really then need to think about is, well, who are English learners? What are some of the characteristics that come to mind when we think about this population? And I think that oftentimes some of those characteristics are not exactly what in fact represents this very diverse population of learners. So again, this is a little tricky to say most, but it is the case that most English learners are not newly arrived immigrants. And that might be what some folks think, even in the education sector. So most English learners are actually US born, US citizens. The majority are in the US context from Spanish speaking homes, but hundreds and hundreds of languages are represented in the homes of English learners. So I want to be clear about that, although the bulk of research in this area has focused on Spanish speakers because they are the largest group of English learners in the US. It is also the case that most English learners have effectively been instructed and continue to be instructed in English-only instructional context. And this is an important point to underscore, and I think and hope I will remember to bring this up again momentarily, because there tends to be this narrative that English learners and their families are resistant to learning English. And in fact, in my many years of being a school teacher and now being in academia and working very closely with English learners and their families across a pretty wide developmental age range, I have yet to come across a family who does not want their child to succeed in English. And there are a lot of myths and misunderstandings related to the use of the native language that I hope we end up as a field being able to address and help families understand that using their home language is not a risk. English learners are generally a young population and are largely concentrated in the elementary school grades around K-5. This varies a little bit. And one of the key concerns, and the large reason that I am here to speak with you today, is that, as I mentioned before, English learners tend to lag behind their English proficient peers when it comes to their academic achievement. And here I will focus on reading, but this is also the case across other subject areas. And so we need to then really ask ourselves, all right, well, why are they disproportionately and persistently lagging behind as a group? This is a very diverse group. Like, what is it that is the issue at hand, or issues? And so not too long ago, you saw an image of 1 in 3, and that was a representation of the reading achievement of US students in general, not disaggregated in any way, shape, or form. But when we then zone in on the population of English learners in the US, it is the case that only about 1 in 10, and actually this is an overestimate, the situation, or I should say kind of more of an optimistic picture, because nationally it is the case that about 10% of 4th graders, but only about 4% of 8th graders who are formally classified as English learners can read at or above the proficient level. That is really problematic. And I think we should all be concerned about this because English learners are not only already a large portion or a segment of the school age population, but a growing segment. And as I just mentioned, the majority are effectively US born, instructed in English instructional context. So we have to wonder what is going on. Why are they often labeled as quote unquote at risk? What are they at risk for? And why are they at risk? So of course, that's a $1 million question. I wish we could address that here, but I have just thrown in literally a couple of the things that came to my mind, and not because I made them up, but came to my mind in terms of what are some of the factors that that folks and in the literature tend to be associated with an at-risk status, specifically for English learners. And I won't read these all out to you. Certainly, limited English proficiency stands out as something quite specific to the English learner population, because by definition, they are in the process of developing their English skills. But these are largely situational factors. And so that means that I really hope that if there's something you can take away from this brief talk, is that we need to really consider why we use this label and move away from kind of categorizing and overgeneralizing, and think about what we can effectively do in the classrooms to better understand who this population is if we're serious about supporting their development. And so what I want to do next is just talk about a few of the enduring debates centered on how best to support the reading development of young English learners. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. In fact, it is a very short one, but I thought that these are worthy items for us to discuss. I will begin with the issue of identification and reclassification of English learners. I'll also talk a bit about special education status, and end with the academic expectations that we have of English learners. As you will see, I do not have language of instruction here. And in fact, that is probably the enduring debate in the field, even though the vast majority of English learners, I'll say that again, are instructed in English-only instructional contexts. Yes, there are other program and language models to serve this population of learners, but the majority are in English-only instruction. So that's the main reason that I'm not going to spend time on that, the nature of that debate, and that's where the field has concentrated, I feel, too much of their efforts. All right, so when we think about the issue of identification and reclassification, to me, the main question is, are we actually identifying the population of learners that we want to identify, in this case, English learners? And so it's worth just a quick mention of the 2015 Every Student Succeeds Act. And really the key thing that I want to underscore is that states are effectively required to include the acquisition of English proficiency by ELs in their overall statewide accountability. And so they also must have entry and exit procedures for EL services that are standardized across the state, which was not the case. One of the key ways in which English learners are identified is via a home language survey, HLS. And so there is actually wide variation in these, which instruments are used across states. And I just, on the left, I have included, I won't read those to you, the typical home language survey questions that are asked. And if a parent or caretaker responds to yes to any of these, that basically anything that's not English only, then the student is flagged as potentially an English learner and administered an English assessment. That's where we get to the English language proficiency assessment. And the idea is that you must assess all 4 language domains. So speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And so before I forget, because I kind of skimmed over the second bullet point on home language survey, I unfortunately don't have time to discuss that here, but there is a segment of the English learner population whose parents decline services. So ultimately, the parents decide whether or not they're going to accept the English learner services if their child is identified as limited English proficient. And if the parent decides that they want to waive those services, that group of learners is referred to as waived English learners. And it's a very interesting population, and one that I've started doing some research on with state level data in Tennessee. And I will say that there's an interesting intersection in terms of potentially being overrepresented in special education if the students are, if the parents have waived English learner services. And I only mention this to say that the parents can decide whether or not to accept the services, but even if they waive the services, they are still, for accountability purposes, the student is still identified as an English learner. All right, so then we get to this point of another term. So many terms. Long-term English learner. Okay, what does this mean? Some of you may have heard of this term. Essentially, this refers to English learners who are not making the progress to be reclassified as English proficient within an approximately 6-year timeline. And if you think of a typical English learner entering hypothetically at kindergarten, at formal school entry, this means that many, not all, but many long-term English learners are identified as long-term English learners by the time they get to middle school. And so this is really begs a lot of questions, including the question of, could there be a learning disability? Is there something going on that is really impeding the student's ability to acquire English that is not language-based? At the same time, reading is very language-based. And if we see that the student, for example, is struggling with something like English reading comprehension and is an English learner, we might assume that this is simply because they haven't acquired enough English language skills yet. So it's a real dilemma and a real tricky scenario to engage with. And really leads to another enduring debate, which is the issue of how we identify English learners who require special education services. And what I have here, it's a very busy graph, so I'm sorry about that. You can just see these are essentially the percentage of students in the US served under the under IDEA. And so on the bottom, you have the different disability types. And what I really want to draw your attention to is the specific learning disability category. The blue bar represents the percentage of English learners served under IDEA, and the yellow or golden bar represents the percentage of non-English learners served under IDEA. And I think you can easily see that there are proportionally a larger percentage of English learners identified for specific learning disabilities compared to their non-English learner peers. And so this has been an issue that over the years has become more and more of an interest to me because of the real big implications of this potential over identification. And so there are new regulations, equity and IDEA. In January 2017, the Obama administration issued these new rules, the equity and IDEA regulations. And the idea was that states should comply by around summer of 2018. So the key point is that the regulations seek to help districts address racial and ethnic disparities in identification for special education. But there has not been a huge focus, at least not yet, on linguistic diversity and this intersection of special education and language status. And just looking at this in particular specific learning disabilities representation, you get some questions raised of potential disproportionality. Are English learners being identified for specific learning disabilities more than they should be, is the bottom line. And I want to point out that SLD subsumes reading comprehension difficulties. And we know that disproportionate percentage of English learners, as you have seen, struggle with reading comprehension difficulties. So on the left, I just included for you, just as a reference, the federal definition of specific learning disabilities. And so we really need to think about, all right, well, what are some of the exclusionary factors related to identifying students with specific learning disabilities? So here are the exclusionary factors, and you can see that unfortunately, many of these are very hard to disentangle from English learners, including and specifically limited English proficiency. It should be an exclusionary factor, but in fact, it is the case that language experiences are associated with eligibility for special education, and in particular, eligibility for specific learning disabilities, again, which subsumes reading comprehension difficulties. And so then the question is raised of, well, is this because of a lack of appropriate instruction, for example, in reading? But we do know that learning disabilities, of course, can coexist with limited English proficiency. So we need to think about this issue that has been reported in the field, a good amount of shifting representation, where in particular English learners, students, seem to be under-identified for special education during the elementary grade years. And then there seems to be a shift to over-identification during the middle school years and beyond. And sometimes this is explained by a kind of wait and see approach that teachers, maybe understandably don't really understand second or multi-language development and acquisition, and are thinking, well, the issue is just that they need better English language skills. So we're not going to, we don't want to jump at a referral just yet, or a potential referral. But then when students are not, succeeding at the task of acquiring English language skills, then it may be that, okay, something might be going on. So the real central issue in my mind has to do with the availability of assessments generally, and certainly of valid assessments to be able and differentiate this. And so the last enduring debate that I will talk about is academic expectations. And this is a really important one. So what I mean here is we really need to pause and consider what we expect students to do. And here let's anchor it back on English learners in particular, and why we have those expectations. So we have to really understand multi-language acquisition if we are going to support this growing population of learners. And so the figure there on the left may or may not be helpful, but the whole idea here, based on the revised hierarchical model, is that essentially bilinguals or multilinguals are not two monolinguals in one person. Their language knowledge is distributed across their languages. Here's, we're going to stick with two, but it can certainly be more than two languages. So it's not like there's a language system for one language and then a totally separate language systems for another. And of course, there's the issue of differential experience in the two languages that's really going to matter. So, and there's the context in which the language learning is happening. So if there's anything to distill from this kind of busy slide, is that bilinguals, let's just stick with bilingual terminology, are not two monolinguals in one person, and their language knowledge really is distributed. If we think back to something like the simple view of reading, where we know that word recognition is predictive of reading comprehension outcomes, and especially language comprehension predictive of reading comprehension outcomes, it really begs a whole lot of questions of how we are tapping the language knowledge of our students, which, as I mentioned, oftentimes it's not happening in schools unless you're an English learners. But when it does happen, it's typically occurring in a mechanism by which we are assuming that English learners are kind of like two monolinguals in one person. And this is what I mean. So when we think about how we assess students in typical standardized assessments, usually we have assessments that are conducted in English only, meaning the response must be in English only. If you respond, for example, in Spanish, and it is correct, but it is not the correct target language, it is marked, the item is marked as incorrect. In a better case scenario, you might assess an English learner from a Spanish-speaking home with a Spanish-only assessment. And if they respond to an item in English, and technically it's correct, but they responded in English and they were supposed to respond in Spanish, it is also incorrect. And so what has emerged over the years, and there's been more and more work dedicated to the validity of assessments for this population of learners, are measures that account for both languages. And again, we'll stick with the example of Spanish-English bilingual students. So that, for example, in a typical vocabulary assessment, If an item is presented, the student can respond in either Spanish or in English, and the item will be scored as correct. That may seem intuitive and logical to us all, but in fact, that is not what is happening in school settings. What is happening is that students are being assessed largely in English only, sometimes in their home language, let's say in Spanish, but almost never is it the case that we are using measures that are designed for and normed on the population of students we are using them with, such as English learners. And what I'm going to show you here really briefly is when we look at the vocabulary trajectories of students who are from Spanish-speaking homes educated in English-only instructional context, this is their trajectories from preschool. The beginning point is preschool, ending at the end of the elementary grade years at 5th grade. So the solid black line represents the national norms, which are the same for English and Spanish. And you can see what, the national average and expectation is, so to speak. The long blue dashed line represents the English only vocabulary skills of this sample of Spanish English bilinguals. And the red smaller dashed line represents their Spanish skills. And this is a very typical scenario of the vocabulary profile that we get when we assess students who are Spanish English bilinguals as monolinguals. We get a trajectory in which we see that students are especially low on Spanish vocabulary, but they're also low relative to national norms on English vocabulary. And so it kind of creates a scenario that really begs the question of, well, they seem at risk. Is there a learning disability? We're testing them in both languages, and yet they're below national norms, even or especially if they're tested in Spanish-only vocabulary. But we have to keep in mind that the great majority of English learners in the US are instructed in English-only instructional context. If that is the case, there is no reason for us to expect that they are going to continue to be developing academic Spanish vocabulary skills, for example. And so what I have done over the last couple of years is really looked at what happens if we use vocabulary measures that are not designed and developed and normed on monolinguals only, but that they are designed and normed on Spanish English bilinguals in the US. And what you have here are vocabulary trajectories where we are using a measure that I'm calling here conceptually scored. And these are the ones where students are able to answer in either English or in Spanish, and it's going to be marked correct. They're not penalized for using one of the two languages that they know. So the idea is that we're really trying to be more equitable in the approach that we take to understand their language knowledge. And we had two cohorts of students. One cohort was students who started in our study in year one as kindergartners, that's the red. And then we also simultaneously recruited a cohort of second graders. So they started in second grade at the beginning of year one, and we followed them for 2 years. So the kindergarten cohort was in second grade at the end. The second grade cohort who started in year one was in 4th grade by the end. And the key thing to show you is that there is a black line, you may not be able to see it for both of these, somewhere underneath there, which represents the national norms, what we would expect students to, their vocabulary trajectories to be. And you can see that these are basically overlapping. Well, what does that mean? That essentially means that there is not this flagging of at-risk status that we see. I'll go back to this graph for a second. Here, when we see a gap between the black line, which is the national monolingual norms, and the blue English-only vocabulary or the red Spanish-only vocabulary, there are pretty significant gaps, especially in Spanish, that are growing over time, even though it's narrowing in English, but still significant at the end of the elementary grade years. Here, there is no such gap, but this is surely due to the type of measures that are being used and to the way that we are tapping vocabulary, which is much more aligned with scientific understandings of multilingual language development. And so What does this all mean, right? Well, there are going to be varied opinions. I'm really excited to hear what folks have to say. But some of the opportunities that I think that we have at hand are as follows. So these are some of what I'm calling tangible takeaways. I hope that you are able to walk away from this presentation at minimum thinking about or thinking more about what is meant by the term at risk. So I hope you walk away, or hopefully you already knew this, that speaking another language or languages is not a risk. And to really work on framing conversations in a way that does not position English learners as being challenges. And that to me would be a win, number one. Also, to remember that English learners are a very diverse group. And so it's really frustrating when I hear certain conversations about who English learners are or are not, and what some of their typical characteristics might be. But a lot of people tend to not understand that the majority of English learners are actually US born US citizens. And again, of course, there are English learners who are newly arrived immigrants. I am not by any means trying to say otherwise, but the great majority are US born US citizens who have been educated in English-only instructional contexts. So we really need to think about the diversity very broadly, and at the same time understand some of the more common characteristics. And just knowing that, I think, for educators will be really important in terms of the expectations that we have. Speaking of expectations, I hope this sounds like preaching to the choir here, but like every learner, English learners can succeed. There is nothing in the way of their success other than limited opportunities to learn. They have the potential. I haven't had a chance to talk about giftedness. You saw a little bit on special education in terms of areas of need, but there is this whole other question about the identification of English learners as intellectually gifted. And it is a very depressing picture where too few are being identified. And that is an issue that we have to address head on. And the last item I have is instruction. It is the case that similar factors that we know are predictive and influential of reading comprehension achievement, as you saw at the beginning of the presentation, word recognition, language comprehension, are the same factors that are important for English learners. And so it's going to be really important that we continue to support their word reading development and their language comprehension skills. Over the years, I didn't have a chance to show you a lot of the work that I have done and some of those results. But if we're going to think about equitable assessments that can help guide instructions, we really need to make sure that we are supporting students' ability that we are explicitly supporting their word reading development, is what I mean to say, and specifically their decoding skills. Yes, English learners come from homes in which a language other than English is used to some extent, and some of them are more and some of them are less proficient in their home language and in English. So the sound sensitivity is going to be something that teachers of English learners need to really attend to, while keeping in mind that the majority have been exposed to English for a long time. But that sound sensitivity in terms of word reading and phonological awareness, instruction, etc., is going to be essential. But more so is the support that is needed at the language development level. So like all learners, but especially English learners, really need opportunities and actively designed, purposely designed opportunities to use language, to hear it, of course, but also to use it in the classroom. And I know that that is easier said than done. I was a school teacher. Now it seems like many moons ago. But, you know, it's sometimes frustrating to hear like, oh, use high quality language. Well, can you help us a little bit and guide us into what that means? But the key takeaway here is please provide those opportunities for language development and conceptual development. And if a student speaks a language other than English at home, that language or languages are not going to interfere with or impede the development of English. That is a fact that we do know, and that we really need to get that messaging out more loud and clear. All of this said, as a field, unfortunately, we continue to have a shortage of qualified educators. And I mean this broadly speaking, certainly classroom teachers, English learner specialists, but also counselors, administrators, community support personnel in the schools. I do think that professional development is a start. And to be more specific, I mean professional development about basic things like a better understanding of who English learners are and what we mean by something like the at-risk term, I think are really important conversations for teachers to have in professional development seminars. And also to think about and better understand the process of multilingual language acquisition if we are going to work toward more equitable assessment to support students' English reading comprehension skills. Without question, I think that the intersection of language and special education status is an area that is really ripe for more research and is very timely. And we really need to think about the whole referral process and what that looks like, because these are really consequential decisions for all learners and certainly for English learners. And I can't end this talk without acknowledging the differential opportunities to learn that many students have experienced during this unprecedented pandemic, and really to think about what those implications are, especially for populations that have often been minority, underserved populations that have been in virtual only context, and what this means for the extent to which they have been provided the kind of instruction that we know works to better support their reading development. So I thank you so much for your time and look forward to the live Q&A that follows. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think you got cut off a little early, but it was a great presentation, and I really learned so much just from listening. Thank you, Jeannette.
Thank you. Yeah, I think so. I don't know if it was mine that was lagging or what, but I do think it cut off from me when I was going to talk about the expectations.
Yeah, did you want to finish anything that you were going to wrap up in the end of your presentation?
Well, I'll just say, and thanks to everyone who has joined, that in terms of the expectations, I was just going to mention the whole idea of, I mentioned special education in terms of some challenges that students might encounter, but that there tends to be a significant underrepresentation of English learners and giftedness, which is a real issue of equity that we need to address. And again, speaks to this whole notion of opportunities to learn versus potential to learn that we should really be anchored on. And the last item in terms of tangible takeaways that I just want to really briefly underscore is that of instruction. And I just want to make super clear that there are very similar factors that influence reading achievement in monolinguals and English learners. And again, back to the word reading and language comprehension. And in terms of equitable assessments, we really need equitable assessments if we're going to effectively guide instruction. And I emphasize language a whole lot, but that is not to discount the need for explicit word reading instruction, especially in decoding and multisyllabic words that are going to get more complex over time. But that language development support, I think, is the real area that has been kind of left aside and not researched as much as word reading has. And we really need to create a lot of opportunities for English learners to actively and use language. So I'll just end there.
Yes, I love that. So if anyone has any questions that you would like to ask Jeannette, you can put them into the chat box. And then I'll just start us off with a few questions while we wait to see if anyone has any to add. So, Jeannette, you talked about most English learners are born in the United States. Why is it then, or how is it that they are not English proficient?
Well, I wish I could answer that easily. And that is really at the crux of like the presentation for today. And for me, it really raises a whole host of questions about the extent to which we are providing effective language support for students. And so I know this is going to sound a little bit controversial, but I'm going to go there anyway, that the idea is to identify students who are limited English proficient in order to provide them with the highest quality English language support services so that they can access the curriculum in English in the typical US classroom context. But what ends up happening too often, and really unfortunately, is that there is often a downward spiral for a whole slew of reasons, and a stigma attached to the label English learners, where teachers and educators kind of broadly might have lower expectations of English learners, and there's a watering down of the curriculum. And again, I am not trying to generalize and say this is the case across all programs and that English learner support services are ineffective. But I hope my message is clear that the idea is, let's identify students who are limited English proficient in order to provide them with the best supports we can. But unfortunately, there's been more and more research in this area, often showing that the very students that need the most language instructional supports in English are getting the lowest quality instruction.
That's so interesting and so unfortunate. I agree. So speaking of knowing about your students' language comprehension skills, do you have suggestions for teachers to equitably assess English learners' language comprehension skills?
Yeah, well, I do think that we have to take a step back, and that for lack of a better word, blame is certainly not the right word to use, but teachers are going to be limited by the availability of measures, and teachers are not generally creating these measures, right? It takes a lot of work, a lot of psychometric and analytic work to create valid measures. And what I mentioned, which I hope was not too complicated, I think it's an easy concept, but the measures that I briefly touched on, which are often called conceptually scored language comprehension measures, the idea there is that we should be interested in assessing conceptual knowledge, whether that knowledge is known in language A, B, or C shouldn't matter. It's about the actual knowledge development. And so we really are, as a field, very limited in the availability of tools, of assessment tools, to assess language generally. Forget about English learners, but just to assess even monolinguals. And yesterday, one of the presentations during this IES Reading Summit, I think was just really fabulous and really underscoring just the national profile of at-risk. It's not that English learners are dragging down our scores, and by I say our scores is nationally, right? English learners are a segment of the US school-age population, an important and growing one, but it's still relatively a smaller segment compared to monolinguals. And so it sounds a little bit convoluted, my answer, but the real question is, as a field, are we going to invest in the development of the kinds of tools that are really going to be able to tap language comprehension? And once we get that work done, we need to go ahead and be able to train teachers to effectively use those and make meaning from them, right? If we're just going to, here's another assessment, give it to your students, and thank you for doing that, it's not really going to move the needle very much. So I know that doesn't sound like a very satisfying answer, but I think the reality is that we have a pretty long way to go, because the development of the tools and the availability of assessments really kind of need to be at the forefront in order for teachers to actually be able to utilize them and to guide instruction. So that's why I think, again, it's a much bigger issue for the field as a whole to really consider.
Thank you. I see Catherine just put a question into the chat box, and I think it connects with the next question I had for you as well. So I know you mentioned in your presentation that, for most English learners, instruction is in English only. Why has there been such a focus on the language of instruction, and what impact do you feel it has on students?
Okay, that's a good question. Well, I think that it's just, probably natural. You think of an English learner, what is the first, like the defining characteristic, or one of the most defining characteristics is that it's language based, right? They're developing the English language skills. So work has really, and at least research, right, has really focused on, is it better to provide English only? Is it better? What kind of model of language instruction is best? And that, I didn't want to really go into that area too much, because the types of models that are available are obviously varied, but English continues to be the predominant model. And even with English being the predominant model, we still see the situation, as you noted, one of the first questions as to, okay, well, why are English learners still struggling? And I think it's really more a question of the, sounds a little cliche, I totally get it, but of the quality of the instruction that's being provided. And personally, I would advocate for the use of multiple languages. I don't think scientifically, children are not confused if they're bilinguals or multilinguals. And we know globally that across different countries, children learn to speak multiple languages and are achieving quite well. So that's not really the issue, but we really do. And I got cut off in the presentation, so I wasn't able to talk about kind of next steps as a field, but we really do have a shortage of qualified educators to be able to provide language instructional supports other than English, and even with English itself. I don't think the majority of US educators are being prepared in such a way that they are able to provide really solid language development support that's sustained throughout the school years. And again, this is not placing the blame and saying teachers are to blame. I was, as I mentioned, an elementary school teacher. On the contrary, it's like, what kinds of supports are we as a community of educators going to provide, so that we don't just say, all right, please provide high quality language instruction. Well, what does that actually mean? We don't know that much about it, actually.
Awesome. Thank you. So Catherine is saying that she finds the multilingual model of assessment really interesting, and she wondered if you could speak to the use of non-English languages in other subject areas. For example, she mentioned using Spanish within math. Would that be a good goal in order to better to support English learners?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. And absolutely, like just for the purpose of this presentation, I really was sticking to reading, but it's across disciplines. For sure. And just to think of math, for example, there tends to be, first of all, a really significant and high correlation between English learners, for example, reading achievement and their math achievement. And math, I don't think certainly all, but folks might think of math as, oh, well, this is just numbers and it's, across languages, it doesn't really matter. Well, math is very language based. And as over time, right, we think of word problems. It's really not just numeracy and knowing your math facts. That's part of it, but it's a lot of language-based learning that's happening, whether it's in social studies, history, science, or mathematics. So I definitely think that the use of Spanish, or at minimum, like I said, and I'm very sensitive and aware of the fact that we are limited in the teacher capacity to be able to provide instructional support in multiple languages, and Spanish is not the only language, right? There's hundreds of languages spoken in US classrooms, but at minimum, I think the mindset and the assessment, if nothing else, of students, so that teachers can really understand that it is not an issue about limited capacity to learn, and that English learners are positioned as smart students, just like any other student who can learn if they are provided with the right instructional supports, is such an important piece. And I think that's missing in a lot of classrooms.
Absolutely. I think that connects to our next question, which is, I wonder how dual language English learner students perform in comparison to non-dual language English learner students. Do you have any research or information to share around that?
I'm not sure I understand the nature of the question. So
she's asking, like, when you look at a dual language school compared to a traditional school.
A dual language instructional model.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Those English learners in the dual language program outperforming those not in a dual language program.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you, Teresa, for the question. Yes, I actually taught at a dual language school during my brief time as a school teacher. And There's actually a lot to unpack there as well. And part of the issue, I wish my short answer could be yes, English learners who are in dual language programs outperform. And I think generally that is the storyline. But there's a lot of complexity in terms of understanding the achievement of English learners in program models that provide native language support, like a two-way immersion program, for example. And so I think a lot of the research really is showing that there tends to be better outcome. And without question, affirming and supporting students' home language is really important for their academic development generally. But when I say that it's a little complicated for me to answer that question, is that oftentimes, or many of these models are configured in such a way that you might have monolingual English speakers that are from a different socioeconomic background than the English learners that comprise the other 50% of the population in a dual immersion model that come generally from a lower income social economic status, if that makes sense. And the reason this matters a lot is just in terms of the trajectories that students get and even the opportunities that are afforded within those models. So I'm maybe making more of a mess of this than it should be, but I have some kind of strong opinions about the configuration of the programs. But if the question is solidly about the native language support, I think to the extent that native language support can be provided, the results tend to be optimal for academic achievement.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat box at this time, but if anyone else has a question, please go ahead and put it in there, or even a comment connected to the conversation we've been having.
Well, maybe, Alyssa, I'll just add, as folks are either thinking or, we're going to log off momentarily, that one of the pieces I didn't get to either, to end the presentation is just that I want to circle back to the need for more research at this intersection of language and special education status. And I think this is a really important line of research, and also tends to contribute to this narrative of at-risk classification, when we really, as a field, I think, need to step back and think about the expectations that we have, the availability of resources, and I mean like human capital, like in the teacher workforce, but also in the tools and physical resources that are available to use with this population of learners.
Absolutely. I see Chelsea's given us the cue that our time is up, but I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us, Jeannette. We just put into the chat box. It was really interesting. You raised so many important topics and issues around English learners. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Take care.
Bye.